Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 500, tape number 500, and it's July the 5th, 1981. Last week I was talking about a two-part article series in the New York Times by Seymour Hersh on the Gaddafi connections in Libya to the CIA, to Frank Terpil, to Theodore Shackley, and various members of the intelligence community, Edwin Wilson, and highest echelons of the CIA, and going into detail background and then detail of the operation of these people as being the nucleus of the assassination teams that have been set up by the Central Intelligence Agency from 1947 up to the present date. The two stories by Seymour Hersh are very important, and I'm going to continue with an analysis of those articles as much as time allows in a few minutes. But I do want to give you the list of names of some very important people. If you have a pencil handy, if you're used to writing them down, if not, you can write to me and I'll mail you a list of these names. Names that you're going to see going back into the history books or in the future more about, and somewhere in the news this week. One is that Theodore G. Shackley, written up by Seymour Hersh. The other is Edwin Wilson, also in these articles. Frank Nugan, who was murdered January 27th, 1980. Michael Hand, and the Nugan Hand Bank that was named after those two men. Michael Hand is loose. He's at large, last seen in Rome with a lot of information in his head. He at least hasn't been murdered yet that we know of. Frank Terpil is now in Libya, hiding out away from the United States. George Korkala is in Europe. Terpil, as I mentioned last week, is ready to make a movie and reveal his role with the CIA. George Bush, John Connally, and Vernon Walters. You know those men. Their names are in the news all the time, and they go back to the first assassination teams in the continuous operation at the present time. William Colby, Michael Sindona, John Hinckley Sr., the Vanderbilt resources that has not yet been exposed. You know the name Muhammad Ali Agca, the man who shot the Pope. A very quiet over in Rome, but very important person like the Hinckley family. Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon. The Wells Fargo Bank, Kevin Mulcahy of the CIA, and Alexander Haig. Now, there are common denominators running through this list. There's 18 names, and there are common cities, operations, agencies, relationships, banking experiences that tie in a whole era of political assassinations and so-called terrorism of the left, which actually incorporates the radical groups that are the right-wing terrorists, and they've been funded by these persons and agencies for a long, long time. Adolf Hitler said at the Nuremberg Congress in September 1933, he talked about the way he could have been stopped by the anti-fascists, and he said the only one thing that could have broken our movement would be if the adversary had understood its principle from the very first day and had smashed with extreme brutality the nucleus of our new movement. If the adversary had understood the principle, and if ever there is a principle to understand, it is involved with these men that I have mentioned and the agencies that have funded them and the modus operandi that has kept them going, operating and being involved in assassination teams, and a lot of dirty tricks and mischief that is bringing the United States to a disgrace around the world. I'm very angry at the appointment that Haig pulled off Lefebvre this week. I never mentioned him when he was up for hearings before the Senate. I ignored him. The Senate turned him down for his human rights post. I figured there was enough news media coverage on him, and you could get that from the newspapers, and I like to cover the stories that you might not see in the smaller print in the back pages and tie them together. But when Lefebvre was sworn in this Wednesday by Alexander Haig as an expert on terrorism and counterterrorism and nuclear proliferation, it was just an outrageous slap at the people in the United States. He was turned down 13-4 by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for his role on human rights and humanitarian affairs. He's a man who was promoting a product overseas that permitted at least 1 million children to be killed each year die, and he knew this was happening. He's a total fraud and fascist, rejected by his own family. His brothers pleaded with the Senate to turn him down. So, being as he was turned down even by people like Howard Baker, who didn't trust him, Haig went ahead anyway and put him on terrorism and counterterrorism and nuclear proliferation. And it is the terrorism part of Haig that he needs in order to become president of the United States, in order to have a martial law, to continue his coup d'etat. He was in the White House at one time with the tapes getting Nixon out of office, and he's there now waiting to take over. And as Hitler said and called the shots, if you could just understand these people and stop them, and they've gone so far already, and smash them with extreme brutality, you could stop their power. Now, Haig is identical to the methods used by Adolf Hitler. He's a protege of Fritz Kramer from Hitler's Nazi Germany, who put in Kissinger and Haig. Those were his two proteges, Kramer's proteges. And the way Hitler came into power was the propaganda of the menace of Bolshevism, and that's what brought the Nazis into full power. He kept talking about communism, and when he was the chancellor, February 27th, 1933, was the famous Reichstag fire, which he provoked as excuse to round up every critic, every radical. And I often refer to Haig as Reichstag Haig, that if he has to drop an atomic bomb on one of these cities, if he has to pass along some germ warfare, if he has to create a war in the Middle East with Mr. Theodore Shackley. One of the shocking parts of the Seymour Hersh article was a description by Mr. Mulcahy of the CIA, who worked with them, his family was in the CIA, how we were sending weapons and arms to not only to Gaddafi over in Libya, but the first training project that they were to do would be to blow up the oil wells, the Aramco oil wells of our allies in Saudi Arabia as a test case. Well, by blowing those up and blaming the leftists in the Middle East, Haig would have the war that he wants in the Middle East and would become automatically the commander-in-chief. That's the only motive you could have for Haig having money sent to Gaddafi to train people to blow up the oil that we use for our airplanes and boats and transportation and mail and for the normal functioning of our factories. The U.S. taxpayers are sending money over there to blow up the oil wells so that our military can pull their Reichstag business. The fact that he put in this terrible Ernest Lefevre into the terrorism part is outrageous, and I believe that, and I keep saying this almost every week, that if we don't go into the Hinckley family and the Bush and the John Connally and the Haig connections to this military coup d'etat, the people that were behind the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan, if we wait too long, they will in fact get their way. The way that the Third Reich worked was to begin the Reichstag fire, and then as soon as Hitler was in, he could round up all of his opponents, and I refer, as I say, to Haig as the old Reichstag Haig. He had the training and the background, and that's what he's about, and I'm furious at his hiring Lefevre and just thumbing his nose at the Congress, the American people, by putting a piece of crap like that into a State Department salary, and he's turned down through all the hearings. They gave him every break they could, and he perjured himself. And then they say a few weeks later, well, here's $44,000. I'll use you in the terrorism, when it's the terrorism links of Alexander Haig that you have to watch very carefully. New York Times had an article, June 23rd, 1981. This was just a week ago. The Europeans link terror to the Arabs, but they disagree on the Soviet Union. And it goes into a lot of detail, a whole half a page. The Western European police, the intelligence, the political officials don't find Soviet terror in Europe or in around the Middle East. They refer to George Habash and the Popular Front that does work in Lebanon, Libya, and South Yemen, but they find that the Europeans are training in these areas as well as the so-called left. And the New York Times article says the right wing have used the government's inability to stamp out terrorism as their excuse in Spain to support authoritarian governments. That's exactly the Reichstag thing again. The right wing in Spain has used terrorism as an excuse to say, well, you need more authority. That's what Haig and Lefevre want. This article goes into a careful analysis of the most violent terrorism is coming from the fascist group, and it refers to the Bologna, Italy bombing where 80 people were killed and 200 were injured. August attack of a year ago. And that again was listed and employed by Licio Gelli, who's now fled to Argentina, as a Nazi. He's always been a Nazi, but set off this bombing where 200 were hurt. And again, the Nazi group that were at the Munich Oktoberfest, where 11 people were killed and 200 people were injured. And the study of the intelligence agencies, people in Europe and America, said that the worst attacks were done by the right-wing terrorists, that they do fewer attacks, but there's more casualties. And this article goes into the fact that there is very little evidence that the Soviet Union is throwing out this kind of violence or terrorism, even though Alexander Haig's shtick that he keeps saying over and over again is that the Russians are doing it. The New York Times says that in February, operationally speaking, the Red Brigades and the Italian group are slowing down and there's not so much terrorism. That's because of since the first of the year, the list of the right-wing people that were funding the Red Brigades became known, and the story of the Italian government scandal broke the back of the current Italian government, and they shifted policies and changed governments drastically in the last several weeks. The New York Times article says early this year, Secretary of State Alexander Haig said that the Soviet Union was following policies that help support, foster, and expand terrorism. The CIA's analysts had difficulty marshaling evidence that would indicate that Moscow was responsible for this terrorism. And they ordered the United States government to rewrite a national intelligence estimate saying, in fact, that Haig is lying. Now, Haig will get support from Lefevre writing up any kind of thing he wants, but the New York Times said they had to rewrite these stories, and then they go into an example that even though the Soviet Union sells large amount of arms to Libya, knowing Libya is a major supporter of terrorist groups, there are also many pieces of evidence, the New York Times said, to support the fact that Libya's main source of funds to buy their weapons comes from Western nations who purchase Libyan oil. The Russians have their own oil. The United States and Great Britain buy Libyan oil, and with that money they buy weapons, not from Russia, but from the United States. And it was Theodore Shagley and Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil and George Korkala and the assassination teams going back through the entire era of the CIA who send Libya the weapons for the terrorism. That's the New York Times chastising Haig's remarks and trying to put to rest some of the lies that are taking place. Now, in the book, The Great Conspiracy by Albert Kahn and Sayers, they list the coups that took place as soon as Hitler was in power in Germany. From 1933 to 1934, they described in their book a mysterious malaise that took care of the nations in the world. There were suddenly coups d'etats, there was sabotage, assassinations, revelations of cabals and conspiracies, and hardly a month passed from 1933 to 1934 that there wasn't treason and terror across Europe. And it goes into the Nazi German infection of different countries starting in January of 1934, and it refers to the French, the Cagoulards, the Iron Guard in Romania, the Croix de Feu in France, the British Union of Fascists. And it lists about 12 or 14 countries and the crimes that took place as soon as Hitler was in office: the assassination of the Secretary of the Soviet Embassy in Poland, the assassination of the Premier in Romania by the Iron Guards. These were all fascist attempts. An uprising in Paris in 1934, an attempted coup d'etat in Estonia, attempted coup d'etat in Bulgaria, attempted coup d'etat in the Baltic Brotherhood country, Latvia, the assassination of General Pieracki, a Polish minister of the Interior. And there's a list of about 12 or 14 countries' attempted coups and murders that took place very quickly as soon as Adolf Hitler was in power. Well, if you take your newspapers from the time of the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, and that would be a good indication of violence taking place, because you don't have to do too much history investigation to follow the 8 years of California violences of the same type when he was the governor. But starting with John Lennon, I've mentioned that, the murder of Lennon in December 8th of 1980. March 1981, 90 days after Reagan was in office, there was an attempted coup d'etat of Bush, Haig, and the Defense Department trying to take over the White House in the United States of America. In May, there was attempted murder of the Pope with the links to Lucio Gelli and the fascist group going all the way from Spain to Argentina to Hitler's Franco Peronist Mussolini gang. Each one of these things I'm talking about has a common denominator. There was the murder of the president of Ecuador, Mr. Roldos, in May of 1981. May 31st, there was the murder of the president of Bangladesh. In each case, one was a liberal Democrat, the other was the only hope of the people in Bangladesh. There was the attempted murder of Mrs. Gandhi. Her airplane was damaged and was sabotaged. There was an attempted coup in February of the king and queen in Spain by the fascist government. In March, another murder plan for the king and queen of Spain was uncovered by the same interlocking group. In June last month, there was an attempted coup to stop the election in Greece, where Andreas Papandreou is running for the head of Greece right now. The election comes up soon, and they tried to stop that. In March of 1981, there was an attempted coup of the small island of Dominica for the Nazis, the organized crime, with high echelons of American officials involved. June 1st, 1981, the foreign minister of Morocco, the airplane almost crashed, and he survived. He was the man who was instrumental in setting up the arrangement of 52 hostages to come home. At first, they said there were no survivors. Major General Ahmed, AHMED, was killed. A Bangladesh official was killed right after the president of Bangladesh. And then June the 7th, 1981, a Libyan-based assassination group was attempting to kill the president and his wife of the Philippines, the Marcos. Not that they're so perfect, but if they've been involved in past scandals or can't cover them up, such as Ronald Reagan or Pope John Paul II, they're expendable. That was called Operation June Bride, the plans to kill them in the Philippines. And there also had been $70 million sent out of the Philippines 2 months ago that I talked about on KLRB before that assassination attempt took place. So if you don't see a parallel between what happened when Hitler was in power in Nazi Germany and between Alexander Haig and Bush, George Bush, the former director of the CIA and now the vice president, with their interlocking links to the John Hinckley family in Houston, Dallas, and in Colorado, then you're going to have trouble seeing the news for the next years to come. If you can't believe that every one of those that I listed has been reported as a fascist attempt to overthrow those countries or a successful murder so far, and that's just 6 months that we've had, a little less than 6 months since Ronald Reagan was president. There was an article in February of the Washington Post, Richard Reeves, Reagan turns America away from the history of human rights. This was an article about that horrible Lefevre who just got on the payroll of the State Department. It was chewing him out for his having a dinner party and praising people in Argentina. The guest of honor was Willard Butcher, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. The quotations of Lefevre and Alexander Haig were disgusting, and they quoted Lefevre as saying, the human rights activist, Lefevre wrote, tend to underestimate the totalitarian threat to the West. People who think about human rights underestimate totalitarian West and the totalitarian temptation in the third world. They neglect or trivialize the fundamental political and moral struggle of our time, that we have to be preoccupied with the Soviet Union and nothing matters except that. You can torture, you can kill, you can brainwash, and you can take the repressions of Argentina and South Korea and wipe them off. Ernest Lefevre was written as a disaster by many columnists. And again, the old Reichstag Haig has to put him on the salary, and we have to pay his salary. Michael Harrington wrote in the New York Times in January 1981, January 28th, Reagan was president, 7 days, for the nation, a risk of moral amnesia. And he wrote how we'd go down the drain because we'd throw away all the ideas of protecting innocent people or slaves, hungry, oppressed, and so forth, and throw that out the window. Reagan was just president 7 days when that came about. Now, there's a name in the news, there's several names in the news this week or currently that go back to the repressions, the assassination teams. One is that Theodore Shackley that I talked about last week and we'll talk about more, who is smoked out or screened out or identified by Seymour, Hersh, and by Kevin Mulcahy of the CIA in these current articles in the New York Times. In the New York Times last week, there was a book review, and in the Washington Post, there's a new book called The Third Option, An American Way of Counterinsurgency Operations, written by Theodore Shackley, the same one who was arming Gaddafi to blow up Aramco oil and giving torture weapons to Idi Amin, and arming Carlos the terrorist to do murder all over Western Europe and the Middle East. Shackley is, according to this book review, and it's a current book, was in the CIA 30 years. He was the station chief of South Vietnam. That's what the book review says in the Washington Post. It doesn't say he was station chief of Laos, where he had the opium-growing, killing assassination teams, or that he formed the Nugan hand bank of narcotics and assassination teams in Australia. It says he was station chief of South Vietnam, and he claims the United States could have won the war in Vietnam, that it was a righteous war. That's what Reagan keeps saying. And now he surfaces as a possible candidate for the highest office of Reagan's CIA. The Washington Post said Theodore Shackley may surface. Now, it's hard to believe after the exposés that are coming out of Frank Terpil or Kevin Mulcahy, who's also writing a book, that they couldn't smoke out Theodore Shackley and the links of him and George Bush to assassinations in the United States, besides around the world. But this government is so outrageously flagrant that if we don't watch this and write letters to public officials, Shackley may in fact end up on Haig's staff, or he's probably there now. His book is published by McGraw-Hill and Reader's Digest, and for those of you who know those names, you might say, well, what else is new? He wants to be a candidate for high office in Reagan's CIA, and he wants to be an advisor to El Salvador and Angola. And the book review says that he has a blueprint for what should be done. He thinks we need a less fettered CIA. He wants the control he had overseas. He thinks there should be no limits on their actions, that they should get back to the good old days, and we should give counterinsurgency a chance. He wants to direct the policy, if he isn't doing it, in El Salvador. And that's why it's so important to study history, because not only is this dog killing and dealing the drugs and setting up the assassination teams from the day the CIA was formed, involved with the Bay of Pigs and the people that killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Vietnam policy, the Laotian policy. He was in Chile for the killing of Allende and the destabilization. Now he wants a high-level government job like Vernon Walters to advise us on Angola, which probably includes most of Africa, and El Salvador, which then gets into all of Central America. This is the man, as I say, who wanted to train people. This is a New York Times article, train people in Libya, and as their general first test, they're testing them out as first graduates, according to the New York Times, June 21st. The first graduates of the terrorist school would demonstrate their skills by blowing up Aramco pipelines in Saudi Arabia. Now, that dog wants to have a high-level job in the CIA, and is getting prominent with his book on terrorism and how great the CIA is and how wonderful, what a wonderful job they're doing. If you have any questions about the kind of job he ran in Vietnam, he was over there along with Edwin Wilson, but Theodore Shackley was the big station chief of Vietnam and Laos at a time of torture and sending the heads of states out of Cambodia, and then carrying on the Phoenix program. The Phoenix program is the group of agents from the Green Berets and the assassins. Then it went into the Nugan hand bank and spread all over the world for future murders. The statistics on the Phoenix program of people being neutralized, killed, jailed, rallied, is very impressive. William Egan Colby of the CIA was the director of the program, and Theodore Shackley was the CIA boss over there. And 70,000 people in Vietnam were neutralized. That's just from 1968 to 71. They called it neutralized. They captured 28,000 and jailed them, and they were in tiger cages and tortured. 17,000 were, they said, rallied, and they didn't define what they did with them. Over 20,000 they admitted they killed, and Shackley was one of the people that tied ropes around their ankles and dangled them from flying airplanes. He wants to be our advisor according to the current Washington Post in El Salvador. And as I say, if Haig has his way, he's worked with the Special Forces, the Green Berets, and Theodore Shackley from his days over in Taiwan and South Korea and on into Washington, where he took over the White House when Richard Nixon was pushed aside, and he rallied for a few days or weeks as the acting president and wants to do that now. Now, William Colby's plan in Vietnam was so successful that he came home to the United States and became the director of the CIA. He announced at the hearings how many people he killed, so there's a good chance that Theodore Shackley could become an advisor to El Salvador. It's pretty disgusting, but there is a pretty good chance that he could. Another one of his gang, as I say, is this general, Vernon Walters, who's worked closely with him, with Shackley. They worked with the Orlando Letelier murder, and Sandra Moffit in Washington, D.C., the murder on Embassy Row. Well, Vernon Walters has advised all our presidents for the past 5 years, and there was an article in the Associated Press. It was carried in all the newspapers June the 5th. General Walters is chosen by Ronald Reagan to be an ambassador at large. The White House had announced that Walters, 64, a retired three-star general and former deputy director of the CIA, played a key role at the outset of the Watergate cover-up, and now that Ronald Reagan is president, he has sent him as an advisor where? El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, down in Central America. The old Bay of Pigs team, the Vietnam team, the people that have stirred so much trouble around the world while they armed Idi Amin and Gaddafi with torture and weapons and assassination weapons to do their killing all over the world. General Walters' name is in the news, Vernon Walters, because he wants a key job. I got out a book. I recently got this book, and as soon as I saw Walters' name, I knew his role with the Letelier story and the Chilean story that involved Shackley, because he was down in Chile at the time Allende was murdered. There's a book, Assassination on Embassy Row, and it tells about Mr. Contreras, who was a high official in the Chilean government who worked on the planning of the murder of Orlando Letelier and Sandra Moffit in Washington. And this book describes Fernandez and Townley, two men involved in these murders, speaking with Contreras, who referred to General Walters as his friend on his visit to Washington in August 1975. That's 1 year before these murders. Walters received him at the CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia, the intelligence officer's Mecca. To Contreras, Vernon Walters was in a league with the other political appointees currently in office under the current director of the CIA, George Bush. Walters was a lifelong soldier on the fighting side against communist subversion. He could sympathize with Contreras' arguments on the use of the disappearance of people and the use of torture in dealing with Chile's suspected communists. Not one that were tried, but suspected. Walters was on their side with George Bush to have people disappear, to have them tortured. They had their people in the White House. This is the end of the first 30 minutes. We'll take a 1-minute break and then come back on this list of horror stories of people in Washington today.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
The reason I gave you the list of names when I began the program, it's so important, is that people like Theodore Shackley want high jobs, reappointed again with the authority to kill public leaders, to torture, to have disappearances. Keep in mind that when Walters is talking about disappearances, there were 10 to 20,000 people disappeared in Argentina, thousands in El Salvador. Brazil has their death squads. They hardly have political prisoners. And all over South America. Vernon Walters has been a part of that. George Bush, according to the men that killed Letelier and Sandra Moffit, were familiar that Walters and Bush were in their league, that they went along with that as directors of the CIA. And the evidence in this book, the Assassination on Embassy Row, goes on and on of the links of these people to the Nazis in Chile, the Nazis in Paraguay, and Uruguay, the passports that were written for them to come to this country to kill, the Cubans that came out of New Jersey, that was the George Korkala group, The assassination that took place on Embassy Row involved anti-Castro Cubans that had been directly involved with Frank Sturgis and the murder of John Kennedy. There is a linear connection going through all of these assassinations and murders, but what is so frightening is that every day they surface with more power. Everything they did in the past was a failure, and they come up with more power. People like Shackley and Walters and Lefevre really should be buried or hung. And yet they move up, and when they try to have a coup in this country to kill the President of the United States, they take that person away to a military base, and you don't see him or hear about him, and that is another travesty to go into, and I want to bring a little bit update on some of these stories that are going on. As Adolf Hitler said, there's only one thing that could have broken his movement: if the adversary had understood its principle and from the first day had smashed with extreme brutality the nucleus of our movement. And the only way to stop these people is if enough people understand what is happening. It wouldn't be from the first day, but there are enough illegal assassination attempts and coups going on to stop the power of people like Shackley and Wilson and Korkala and the CIA and the CIA factories for sending ammunition and medicine and poisons to kill and bomb and continue their violence all over their world. Every day there's a new incidence of Libyan guns, food poisoning, and so forth going on, all coming out from the United States. There's an article in the newspaper this week, poison peanut assault sentence in Winchester, England. A Libyan was sentenced to life in prison because he attempted the murder of another Libyan and his family by leaving poisoned peanuts in their home. A Libyan airline worker was supposed to go back. Gaddafi wanted him to return. And when he didn't, then they put poisoned peanuts in the house or kitchen for the entire family. Last week or the week before, I talked about Libya supplying, through Frank Terpil and the United States chemists, supplying cyanide to put in people's food over in Lebanon to see how they reacted. One story that I read about it said that one fellow was eating soup. He took a taste and his face fell right in the soup. And also I referred to the Ku Klux Klan chapters in Germany where several men were giving strychnine to black soldiers, food poisoning there on the base. These are American chemists sent by the CIA overseas to deliver to these various people all these kinds of ways to die, and they are not unrelated to each other. The things that I'm talking about all have common denominators and could be stopped if anyone in this country had enough moxie or nerve to say we've had enough. Now, I mentioned the importance of Muhammad Ali Agca, the man accused of shooting the Pope, and I'll update you on a few of those little Italian scandals. There's a magazine called World Press Review that I get a summary of news events each month, the most important stories for July 1981. And they have a section on banning the baby formula and the scandal in Italy, William Saroyan's death, on the Israeli raid, and so forth. This is the way the press describes the scandal in Italy that I have talked about that is so important. They quote one newspaper in Milan saying the Freemason affair is the biggest scandal in the history of the Republic. Now, you wouldn't know that by looking at your daily newspapers. This is the July summary of World Press Review. You need a microscope to find an article, and you have to go to Section D at the end of the classifieds and a 1-inch news story to find anything that's going on in the American press. In Italy and Rome, they said, this is from Il Messaggero, a newspaper there, in a country where part of the political life is administered by associations such as the Mafia, the Freemasons, and the Secret Service of foreign states, how can the people trust the state? In Great Britain, they said that this scandal is a destabilizing blow that has been dealt to Italy. That is an understatement, I should say. And in Japan, they said, we cannot but suspect that fascism may be reviving in Italy. The Japanese felt that when the scandal broke that a stronger coup had come to stop the silence. As yet, that hasn't taken place. And in Canada, the Globe and Mail from Toronto said the P2 affair is not one more scandal like the others. It is the scandal of scandals. Now, that's a summary from World Press Review, and we're completely deprived in this country of what is going on in Italy, but be sure to know that you will feel the effects of it for a long, long time. It isn't over yet, but they want us to forget it. The reason they want us to forget it is that the same parallels are going on in our government here and the same news medias that are controlled. And if we admit it's there, then we'll link to Michael Sindona and the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and John Connally and Claire Booth Luce and the entire establishment in America that is tangled into the same web. There's one little article on page 49 of the San Francisco Chronicle, $18 million fine in oil tax scandal. Now, it was the oil scandal, one of the things that started to break that secret government, that fascist government, open, and they were looking for the missing money. Well, it goes into a man, Mr. Casanica, who's a refinery operator in Italy, and he fled to Venezuela because he was going to have to go to jail 6 years. He was fined for $18 million for the part he took in the oil scandal. Can you imagine how big the oil scandal really is? If one man from a refinery has to leave the country because he's fined $18 million, the fine is only a percentage of the crime, so you can imagine how big the crime is. Also, the Chronicle yesterday had a little story. It was a one-sentence story with a Reuters underline. Italian Prime Minister Spadolini yesterday completed his coalition government by naming 57 assistant ministers to support his cabinet. Other newspapers, the New York Times, did break down the government, and I'll give that to you on the air maybe next week. But on page, again, in the back pages, a one-sentence description of an entire country that changed within 24 hours or 48 hours its complete form of government. Another article, June 30th, from the Associated Press, an Italian author says terrorism will decline. He's very brilliant. He gave an interview, Mr. Barzini, that he thought that there would be a sensible approach to the new form of government and that the Red Brigades had lost its strength, and he attributed the weakening to the revulsion over the scandal of the people involved in the new scandal and also the murder of Aldo Murro. Well, Aldo Murro was murdered a long time ago, a year and a half ago, and it was no revulsion over that. What's stopping the decline in terrorism, what will stop it, is if enough information is broken open about the United States arming the terrorists, sending the ammunition, the bombs, the kidnappers, and training them. If we stop sending that, the terrorism will stop. As soon as Ronald Reagan was no longer governor of California, the terrorism in California slowed down a little bit. The Manson family, the SLA, the Squeaky Froms, the Sarah Jane Moores, and we could go on to 40 or 50, the Isla Vista, the riots. It's true the Vietnam War wasn't going on at this time, but when you get away the source of the terrorism, the agent provocateurs, then you don't have the terrorism. Now, I want to update you for a few minutes, and I hope I have time to do some more on the Seymour Hersh article, but I want to update a few of these stories that are in the news this week. John Hinckley Jr. is down at a psychological center, a federal center, where he's getting his brains good and fried so that all particles of him that are linked to the Nazi Party will be long gone if and when he ever gets a trial. But I think he'll just plead guilty like Chapman, who shot John Lennon, and just call it quits. Article in the Washington Post this week, psychologists and 3 psychiatrists end their examination of John Hinckley Jr., the team of great psychologists. Then they refer to the men. The panel included a doctor who examined Arthur Bremer, the convicted assailant of former Alabama Governor George Wallace. Well, Bremer got his brains fried at Chestnut Lodge, which is a military intelligence hospital in Maryland, and he's had that smile on his face ever since he was in front of George Wallace and took the electoral votes to Richard Nixon in 1972. He's been a very good boy, sitting very quietly. You don't see or hear a thing about him, interviews or anything. So the same psychiatrist that examined Arthur Bremer is going to Hinckley Jr. And then he's got another psychiatrist who tested Chicago mass murderer John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was a staunch Democrat, a member of the crime syndicate, the guy who disguised himself as a clown for children's parties, who was photographed with Rosalind Carter, just as she was photographed with Jim Jones. His psychiatrist, he's tucked away into a hospital with his brains fried, and they referred to this Jonas Rappaport, a well-known forensic psychiatrist who not only examined Bremer but Sarah Jane Moore. I read an interview of Sarah Jane Moore that Walter Boart did. He's writing an article on it for a national magazine. It's the most tragic, sad thing. I hope he can get published, everything that she said in the article, and I can't reveal it to you. He is the man who wrote Operation Mind Control and mailed to me his interview with Sarah Jane Moore. It is a tragedy what we do to these people's brains, how we fry them and use them and rearrange them and force them to say things that didn't happen in order to hide the murderers and their activities all along. In fact, that book on Murder of Embassy Road tells about in Chile about a young fellow who was kidnapped and taken for several days and burned with cigarettes and tortured. And then he was returned to his home. And then the police came and asked for his father and for him to go down to the police station to question who his kidnapper was, that they had a lineup. And when they got the father there and the son there, they tortured them, and they put the son in a room with a glass window to see a gun at his father's head, and they made him say that Marxists kidnapped him, even though the people that kidnapped him were in the police department torturing him and torturing his father. So they made him sign confessions that 4 labor leaders and Marxists had done the kidnapping, and then the police rounded up the Marxists and could kill them, and then they're not seen again. They tortured these people to make them behave and then use it as an excuse to get somebody else. These psychiatrists that are working on Sarah Jane Moore and Gacy and poor Arthur Bremer, these patsies, they're the ones that are examining John Hinckley Jr., the great psychiatric experts of the world, and it was the psychiatrists that gave Hitler the real Nazi to go ahead with the worst kinds of oppressions that took place in Nazi Germany. They're no different in this country than they were there, and to think there's a difference is a long way off from the point that we supported these things in Germany and we support them here, and they're going on here all the time. Now, there's a Texas congressman, this is not far from the field, named Henry Gonzalez. You may remember his name if you studied the assassination of John Kennedy. He was going to be the man to head the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Then he was removed from the job, and G. Robert Blakey of the CIA and the FBI was brought in to head that committee. Now, this Texas Congressman, Henry Gonzalez, requested this last April, and I've just got around to sharing it with you now, that we should change the Constitution and repeal the 25th Amendment, because he claims that this is a way to take over the United States government. Incidentally, that was put into power by Nelson Rockefeller, who did become the vice president at the time of Watergate, when Nixon was moved out of office. Under provisions of the 25th Amendment, according to Gonzalez, and this is true, a president may be removed from office if members of his cabinet or his close advisors believe that he is physically unable to rule the country. They say mentally, but also physically, because Ronald Reagan could get some blood reaction to the transfusions or some repercussions from the bullets that went into him or other bullets. And the condition is that his advisors, and how would you like the former director of the CIA who worked with Walters and Shackley and that gang of assassins, to be your vice president with Alexander Haig right under there. These people could declare that the president is unable to rule the country. Now, Gonzalez claims that back in 1974, shortly before Richard Nixon resigned, Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger, those are the 2 German kissing cousins, were working behind the scenes to remove Nixon from office under the provision of the 25th Amendment. The Texas congressman adds that following the recent shooting of Ronald Reagan, Haig was again working behind the scenes to set the stage for Reagan's possible removal. Gonzalez says in his words that the right to judge a president's ability to serve in office ought never to be given to the hands of a small, unelected, undefined group of people. Such a decision should be left to the elected body of officials such as Congress. Now, I go along with what Gonzalez says, and I also believe that the Constitution not only should be changed with the 25th Amendment, but the electoral process should be changed. We should have a president, and then he appoints his vice president after he's nominated, which is what happened when John Kennedy said, well, I'll take Lyndon Johnson because he needed that hunk of Texas electoral votes. or Ronald Reagan says, I'll take George Bush, who couldn't win the primaries and get the nomination for himself, the former director of the CIA. But the president may appoint his vice president, but we don't appoint him at all. We don't even know who he's going to have the night that he's elected. And he should be the acting vice president until or if the president is killed, at which time we can elect him in, or if we suspect him of murder, and there were many reasons to believe Lyndon Johnson was responsible for that, or that there was hanky-panky at Watergate with the links of James McCord to Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig and David and Nelson Rockefeller getting Nixon out so they could get their tentacles into the White House offices. If there is the death of a president or the illness, then there should be another election of another president and then let him choose his vice president. That way, the vice president wouldn't be assured of the presidency and he'd have less reason to kill the president. That's the way it happens. He succeeds and he has the power, he has the Pentagon, he has the CIA to get in there and kill the president and then cover it up. He appoints the Supreme Court, he appoints the Attorney General. It's either his right-hand man or his best friend or the guy he owes the most to for being the president. How can the Attorney General investigate that kind of a matter? So Gonzales is referring to the kissing cousins, Haig and Kissinger, the protégés of Nazi Fritz Kramer from Germany and from the American establishment working in the Pentagon. And he's using the example of what they were doing to Richard Nixon. I don't know if he realizes how precisely they were doing it. At the time that Richard Nixon came into office, Alex Butterfield of the CIA and Haig's right-hand man, who worked in the Pentagon with him, was over in Australia, that famous questionable Nugan hand CIA Phoenix program operation. And as soon as Nixon was in, Haig called him and said, hey, come on to Washington now, we're in power. I'm just paraphrasing the way the history books have written it up in the books I've seen. And then Butterfield sets up a taping device to get old crooked Nixon, because you know someday he's going to make a boo-boo. He hasn't been honest a day in his life. And then get rid of the tapes that implicate themselves, or the 18 minutes, and destroy the witnesses of Watergate, which they did, the primary witnesses, and they come out clean and then take over power again. Gonzales has a good idea for the repeal of this, the way that they can decide that the president is too sick to carry on. I want to also update you on the Pope's shooting. There is a great expert that the Washington Post used, called before the Senate hearings, the new committee by Jeremiah Denton, who is farther right than Genghis Khan, is looking for leftists, who's looking for communists, who works with the Theodore Shackleys and the Vernon Walters and the George Bushes and the Haigs. They're looking all over the world to find these leftists in these assassination attempts. So last week they had a witness before the hearings. His name is Yalcin. Ayadin Yalcin, a former Turkish legislator, before the Senate subcommittee, and he testified to Denton and Strom Thurmond, I don't think that Agca is a right-wing terrorist. This is before our Senate hearings. Now keep in mind that no one in the world would believe this except those crazy people in the Senate. The British, the Germans, the Italians, all over the world know who Agca is and where he was trained in Damascus and with the Nazi groups, and how Interpol gave him protection. Only our Senate, Jeremiah Denton, that new fascist that's been voted in, and Strom Thurmond would go along for this kind of testimony. And he says that he believes that even though they said he belonged to the Grey Wolves or the Nationalist Party of Nazis, they don't think that he was a right-wing terrorist at all, this former Turkish legislator. He says that he thinks that the communists did this to create a backlash, that the communists tried to kill the Pope. He doesn't go into the links of Pope Paul II to Michael Sindona, to Licio Gelli, and the scandal that was breaking that involved Alexander Haig's NATO officers who still lost their security clearances in Italy. Now, Denton listens to this kind of crap, and then the worst part was the conclusion. Yeltsin's testimony paralleled, according to the New York Times, similar suspicions voiced by another witness who they didn't name at the subcommittee 2 weeks ago. And part of the reasoning before the Senate subcommittee of this great witness was that right-wing terrorists are amateurs and they get caught. But Agca must be a tool of the Soviets because they don't get caught. The right-wing are amateurs. I have seen right-wing terrorism go on since World War I, and they very hardly ever got caught, and every one of them gets promoted into a higher office, and the news media covers these people up. The right-wing terrorists like the SLA as the CIA never get identified. The Manson family or Charles Watson's links to the Defense Department and organized crime never get identified. The killers of Letelier and Senator Moffit have been protected constantly. The right wing never gets caught, or the people would be outraged. But this former Turkish legislator has to go to the Senate subcommittee. They have witness after witness saying the Soviets did it, and there isn't a person in the world who would buy that crap, and it really is crap. Another story that I mentioned briefly last week, but I wanted to give the source, from Newsweek magazine, February 23rd. Carlos the Jackal is now over in South America. They believe that he first was settling in Egypt. That was the first story, that he was living in Libya. And lately there was another article that said that Carlos was down in Venezuela and had been shot. He's somewhere between Egypt and Venezuela, but he's not with any third world countries. He isn't with any leftist countries. He's been trained and armed by the CIA. This can be documented over and over. And I guess it's about time that somebody get to that Senate hearing, and maybe I'll send them copies of my article. The SLA is the CIA, and go into some of the right-wing terrorism that we push off as the left. There was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle today, so small again, somebody called me to call my attention to it, where the guerrillas get along, and it's an investigation in Rome, again, going into Agca and the killing of the Pope, I guess. They're examining terrorism. And they came to the conclusion that the anti-terrorist police said yesterday, discussing the urban guerrilla groups, that even though there's ideological differences, the communist left group cooperate with the neo-fascist armed revolutionary group, that they're working together, and the harder they look to find the tentacles of the left-wing group, they're sharing safe houses and weapons and modus operandi of the right-wing group. And that gets us back again to Alexander Haig and Terpil, Korkala, or Walters, or Shackley, and the various gang. They have armed, like Adolf Hitler. The right wing has armed what you call the left. And as you examine the families of, say, the Hinckley family, that's a Nazi outfit right from the start, the John Hinckley Jr. outfit. But when you go into the shooting of the Pope, or you look at the Red Brigades, or a man like Kevin Mulcahy begins to tell Seymour Hersh, because he's had 5 years of frustration with the FBI and CIA, how the United States arms chemical companies, weapons, training, factories for killing and assassinations. As these people surface, you're going to find all the nucleus for the Reichstag bombings, the trains that blow up, the airplanes that blow up. One of the things that Gaddafi wanted was missiles, red-eye missiles, to blow up passenger airplanes. That's when Mulcahy went to the CIA and the FBI, and they dragged their feet for 5 years because General Dynamics was to send, they were supposed to order these things. And then the final blow to this Kevin, he was the president of the one of the organizations of Terpil and Korkala, and the outfit in Washington, D.C. was Shackley and Wilson. It was when he opened a drawer marked top secret, and his name was in there, and they forged his name to say that he ordered these particular bombings, like Aramco. See, he's no great hero. He didn't mind doing the dirty work, but he found out he was going to be like Donald DeFreeze and Lee Harvey Oswald and take the rap. And that's when he called the CIA and the FBI and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Not because he's a great hero, but because they were going to use his name and blow up planes and blow up the oil wells, and then he would be blamed, and they would link him as a crazy leftist, I suppose, and they saw forged documents attributing the crimes to him. Well, before I go off there, we got 5 more minutes. I just have one story to tie some of this together. We have to go into it in details later. There is a wedding today in Honolulu, July the 5th. I guess it's all over there by now. Robert Leggett, the congressman who was from Northern California, who was involved with the Great Water, the Korea Gate scandal, Susie Park Thompson. He married her over in Hawaii today. That's quite a marriage. At the time, he was having an affair with Susie Park Thompson, who brought in Reverend Moon and the payoffs of various officials with women and money to vote in favor of South Korea and trade with Korea and so forth. Leggett was living in Washington, D.C. as a congressman from California. He had 3 children and an expensive home in the suburbs of Washington. Then he had another wife and 2 children in a nearby subdivision in the same county. You never saw him charged for any of this kind of action. And then he had Susie Park Thompson on the side. Well, he dumped his 2 wives and his various children, and he went off to Hawaii today to marry Susie Park Thompson. The person who wrote her book, of course, was none other than Robin Moore. He wrote the biography of her and her congressional liaisons and sex and the pillow talk. Robin Moore is the author of The French Connection and The Green Berets, which again involves the Nugan hand, the CIA, the assassination teams, the drug running and narcotics ball of wax. The corporation that Leggett worked for in Washington was called the Oceanic Foundation, and in Hawaii, the Oceanic Institution. And next week, I'll do some more on the Seymour Hersh articles and on Oceanic, because George Korkala and Frank Terpil ran corporations I described in January of 1980 on the air as the Oceanic Corporation that was gun running, Secret Service, assassination teams all over the Third World with narcotics and so forth. So if we can get Susie Park Thompson and Reverend Moon and Congressman Leggett into the Nugan hand activities of Southeast Asia in both Hawaii, Hong Kong, and so forth, then many of the teams will be coming together that have been in activity a long time, that through bits and pieces are surfacing. I've covered a lot of material, and I will get back to the Seymour Hersh articles next week, but I think it's time to call a halt to some of what Haig is doing and write to the State Department and the President and tell them that the Lefevre appointment, the salary this week, is an absolute insult to us, that Theodore Shackley should not be put on the CIA payroll again, and we should find out why he wants to blow up Aramco oil wells and send our money and our training to blow up our own oil that we're getting. Those are good questions. That's a little homework for this week. And in the meantime, if this has gone too fast, and it does go fast, you can write to me at Box 22511 with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you some of these names and the sources of information, because it is a lot of news packed into 1 hour, and people that subscribe to these tape cassettes or play them on other stations do get those printed sheets if they want them. So if you want them, write to me at my P.O. Box in Carmel, and I'll give you a list of the names and institutions that we should be following in for a long, long time. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.